With those logistics out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. George Peridas, who's Director of Carbon Partnerships and leader of the Carbon Initiative from Lawrence Livermore National Labs, and he's going to be talking about the big picture of carbon management. George.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back. It's good to see the symposium in its second year, bigger and stronger and with more interest. Thank you to our hosts for inviting us back, and thank you to every single one of you for either being here in person or being tuned in online. We're going to spend the next 30 minutes or so taking a semi-existential journey into the world of carbon management. Humor me for a little bit. I think we're going to go back quite a bit in time and try and figure out why we're here, what we're trying to do, and what's standing in our way. So I call this the melting pot presentation, and we'll figure out why in a minute. So let's begin with a journey through time and look at the Earth's temperature through the ages. So do take note of the different axis scales on the bottom. We start with thousands of years before present on the bottom right, and then we shift to millions of years before present. So this is somewhat compressed on the left and expanded on the right. The thing that stands out to me immediately is we are in this interglacial period, so warmer than this oscillating pattern that you see in blue. And really some of the things that we consider old, the pyramids of Egypt that were built 4,500 years ago, Homo sapiens emerged 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. We've had it pretty smooth. We've been enjoying this very stable, pretty hospitable climate conditions that have enabled us to do some of the great things that we've done. If you go back far enough in Earth's history, you will see that this place has been very, very different in the past. And one of the points that I'd like to draw your attention to is the spike in green. This is about 10 million years after the dinosaurs went extinct. So we're talking about 55-ish million years ago. This is called the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, or PETM. So this is a climatologist's nightmare, if you like, in present day, because it's a snapshot of what might happen if we let this global warming thing get out of control. So the Earth has been through a very violent history, if you like, and our climate has been much, much more hostile than it is today. So we're not heading towards uncharted territory, but you look at that chart and it should scare you. At least it scares me. The world was a very different place back then. So this PETM peak, this was a world that was entirely free of ice. Ice did not emerge for tens of millions of years as the Earth started to cool off, and you'll see those blue bars. They show you the various ice sheets as they started to emerge. And things looked very different. Obviously, sea levels were much higher. These temperature differences are not compared to today. They're compared to this pre-PETM levels. So the world was a very different place. It looked different, it felt different, and humans would be very different beings if we were living in that kind of world. Now, is that where we're headed? Hopefully not. This is the no-shit Sherlock slide. So 150, 200 years ago, we had the brilliant idea to take fossil carbon that had accumulated in the Earth for millions or even hundreds of millions of years and start dumping it out in one go. It has made a distinct difference to our lives, but it has also had the side effect of warming our planet very rapidly. And we should have seen that coming earlier, but we didn't. So this is a figure from the latest IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, that shows how greenhouse gas emissions have gone up since 1850 and how atmospheric levels of CO2 and global average temperature have gone up in unison. So we've essentially been living, or we have caused the warmest multi-century period in more than 100,000 years. That should come as no surprise, but it's also extremely alarming. And that's why we're here today, because we're trying to manage that. This is a slide that I found very illuminating from Peter Gleich. So you can see the coming and going of the ice ages over the past 800,000 years or so. And there's this very distinct in-your-face spike in recent history. And this is actually about a year out of whack. So we can now proudly add about another 5 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. So you see that red line is jumping up very fast. For those of us who've been around for a few decades, we knew this was happening, and we were maybe noticing some effects. I think it's fair to say that in recent years, those effects have become much more noticeable, much more pronounced, and that unfortunately the feedback that we're getting back from the planet becomes starker and starker every year. So we're really at the point where the upward curve really is starting to kick up, and we are on the back foot when it comes to addressing the problem. The reason being that the Earth isn't like a car that you can stop in a few feet. It's a system with inertia and climate inertia, and even if we completely stopped emitting, as if by magic, today, there is still a degree of warming that's locked into the system. Which brings us to why we're talking about carbon removal. So, that CO2 problem that we have in the atmosphere, well, we need to stop increasing CO2 to begin with. We need to bring atmospheric levels back down, and that means inescapably that CO2 is going to have to return where we dug it up from. It's going to have to go back underground, and that's where geologic carbon storage and carbon removal from the atmosphere come in. Many people have spent their days, their lives, their careers modeling how we could stabilize things and hopefully keep things under reasonable control or bring them back to normal. You'll see those embodied in what they call the 2 degree warming scenarios and the 1.5 degree warming scenarios. So these are theoretical constructs, modeling results that show how we could contain the problem. 2 degrees was considered until several years ago the safe level of global average warming. That's no longer the case. We think that 1.5 degrees is a safer limit, and as the years go by, I fully expect that number to shrink. So we have less headroom than we thought. So people, modelers, try and figure out how global CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions will evolve over time and how we can keep things in check. Most scenarios for 2 degree stabilization rely on CDR, and carbon dioxide removal, so removing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it or sequestering it underground or elsewhere. And the point that I need to make is it's not just the end point. So even if we get to the same point at 2050, it matters hugely how we get there. Do we get there in a hurry, or do we leave it for the last minute and then drop at the tail end? Every year during which carbon stays in the atmosphere, it has a detrimental effect on the climate. So overshooting and then having a crash diet at the end of the century or mid-century is a worse approach than curbing emissions expeditiously. So what about 1.5 degrees? There is no question in scientists' minds that we will also need to find ways to capture CO2, remove it from the atmosphere, and put it back underground. For 1.5 degrees, almost all scenarios rely on this technology or intervention to some degree. We likely need to deploy it to stay within the limits of what science dictates much faster than we can logistically and politically manage. And I have absolutely no doubt in standing here in front of you today and saying that we are going to need this. The folks who think that we can get to climate stabilization without carbon dioxide removal, in my eyes, are as much on the fringe of science as those who don't believe in climate change. So we are going to need this, and how much? Well, that's a different question. This is a snapshot from a very comprehensive study that Princeton and collaborators did a few years ago. And you're probably used to seeing mitigation wedges that would say, okay, solar is going to do this much, efficiency is going to do this much, electrification, vehicles. This is a slightly different approach, so it's focused on the sources of the carbon, so in this case mostly fuels. The light blue is natural gas, the orange shades oil and related products, and then what you get under the horizontal axis is carbon sequestration, so geologic sequestration. So you will see that the bulk of the climate mitigation work is not carried out by carbon dioxide removal. It has a significant role to play, but it's not the protagonist role. It is a role that's going to have to be played alongside everything else. So we're not looking to CDR as a silver bullet. We're looking at really a paradigm shift in how society uses energy, and a great reduction in the fuels, the conventional fuels that we have been used to for so long. But we are still left with a shortfall by mid-century. Residual emissions, sectors that are hard to decarbonize, cement, aviation, agriculture, or simply the candid admission that as humans, we often go slower than we would like, and that we may get to mid-century and realize that things haven't gone as smoothly as we had hoped. So that's where this family of technologies comes in. It's a necessary complement. It's not a savior or a silver bullet, but we absolutely must have it in the portfolio. I want to spend a couple of minutes on the complexity and really the underlying reason why we're all here today, and why we're zeroing in and focusing on CDR, carbon dioxide removal. It's a complex undertaking. So you think, okay, why does this deserve special attention, government assistance, a symposium of its own? It's a complex undertaking. There's real steel on the ground. If you look at the top row, these are some capture units, either from industrial facilities or from the atmosphere themselves. So there's real engineering involved. Once you've grabbed the CO2, you need to transport it. You can do this by rail, by truck, by barge, and by pipeline. Some of these are logistically harder than others. There's a movement that's gearing up to oppose any single pipeline. I think that's, when it comes to CO2, that's shooting ourselves in the foot, because it will have a real impact on where we end up with climate mitigation. And then you have the whole subsurface dimension. So the CO2 needs to return underground. That involves a very careful study of the geology that you're dealing with to make sure that you're putting it in the right places. And then there's the whole regulatory aspect. This is not a straightforward proposition when it comes to permitting projects like this. So really this is a pretty involved undertaking, even though it's proven, it's off the shelf in many cases. It's safe. I've had the luck, whatever you want to call it, of spending several decades looking into the nitty-gritty of how this works, and people in this room have spent probably decades longer than I have. So having been on this journey, I am absolutely convinced that this can be done safely and effectively. This will not pose any risks that are unacceptable or larger to the ones that we've been used to routinely, and that we can be undertaking this responsibly and in a way that doesn't just help the climate, but also helps host communities. That is not a universally held view, and I don't expect everybody to arrive at the same conclusion, especially if they haven't spent this time looking at this technology. But I think this is one of the reasons why we're here together, and why I think that the melting pot approach is warranted in this case. We need to open dialogue channels, and we need to sit down and figure out how we can make those projects work, not just for a specific individual or company or interest group, but for everybody. But to summarize, I think we're here today because this is a challenge, and we need to rise to it. You need engineers, you need geologists, you need civil society, you need lawyers, you need government. We are bringing together disciplines and walks of life, several of them that do not routinely come together. And that is not something that we commonly do. Okay, so there are some roadblocks to doing this, and this is probably where I have stones thrown at me, or hopefully where I plant some seeds about how we can most productively move forward. So I'm going to focus on two specific families of roadblocks, those that relate to industry and those that relate to civil society advocates. So let's start with industry here. So there's undeniably been some confusion around what CDR is and its role because of how it's been portrayed by certain corporations or interest groups. I got into the space in 2006, and I've seen several corporations want this to be tomorrow's technology forever. They like touting the benefits or the great things about carbon capture and carbon storage, but they've done precious little in the meantime to actually advance its deployment. I've also seen them during my time in Washington, D.C. actually fight tooth and nail regulations or legislation that would mandate them to deploy this technology. And I think, that's setting double standards. You want to claim the promise of something, but you're not putting your money where your mouth is and actually developing projects. That is not in anybody's interest. In California in particular, we are dealing with parallel issues that I think exacerbate the controversy when it comes to CDR. We have very close and uncomfortable and, in my view, unacceptable proximity of certain operations with local communities and people. And these have had a very well-documented and profound public health effect, and they've affected the lives of many people, be it from wells in people's backyards, very close proximity of large industrial sources, such as refineries, to residential areas. We have unacceptable air pollution. California, because of both topography and the nature of where communities are and where these industrial facilities are, has exposed its people, and in particular some of its most vulnerable people, to unacceptable levels of pollution. So these are real problems, and I think they cast a distinctive hue on how some residents of the state view CDR. It's not surprising, and we need to do better on all fronts here. At the same time, I'm convinced that CDR does not have to be like this. There are many other ways of deploying projects responsibly, and not just in ways that do not cause any further harm, but in ways that actually improve matters, and we'll get to that in a minute. So here's a confusing situation. What happens if one of those companies that you may consider egregious or your arch enemy is suddenly proposing one of these CDR projects? Well, what do you do then? Is that a bad thing? Well, let's address that in a second. So I came to this country in 2006 from a poor country myself. I'm from Greece. We also have a legacy of environmental problems, pollution, and I came to join the environmental movement. I spent 12 years in the NGO world. I certainly didn't do it for the money. I did it because I believed and still believe in the cause. And I had the fortune of overlapping with some of what I would consider to be the heroes of the environmental movement in this country. So when the EPA first came to be in 1970, these people were fresh out of college. They were pioneering new approaches, new means of tackling pollution problems. Acid rain was at the forefront, just basic pollution that we may consider as a given today. That was not the case back then. These folks got together and said, can a civil society group sue the government for failing to protect its people? So these are people who've really shaped who we are and how clean this country is today. So I had the fortune of overlapping with them. And one of the first things that they told us is, never turn down dialogue. It says, I don't care who you're talking to or who wants to talk to you. They may be your arch enemy, they may be the Antichrist, they may be your litigation adversaries. Pick up the phone, talk to them. Make sure that you engage with them. Never turn down an opportunity to talk. I found that enlightened. 12 years later, I left the NGO world in dismay, I have to admit. The world had become much more black and white, much more polarized, and in place of this dialogue and in place of relationships and respectful exchange, even though we may disagree, I saw pitchforks coming up. Now, don't get me wrong, I think there's a time and a place for this. There are situations where you simply have to draw the line and you have to say, no, this is a protected area, it has special landscape or ecological interest, and you're absolutely not going to develop something here. There are cases where there's distinct and egregious local pollution where there's really no other alternative than to fight it out in the courts and to say no further. But we have to distinguish between the classes of problems, and when we're dealing with global warming, that approach does not solve the problem. Carbon is in everything we do. It's in the food that we eat, it's in the water that we drink, it's every time we travel, it's how we recreate, it's how we see our family. It's deeply embedded nowadays in pretty much everything that we do. And simply fighting and rising up against enemies may solve some things, but it's not going to solve this sharp kink on the right of this curve of rising CO2 levels. So I urge everybody to see CDR not through the light of a big battle, but in the context of a very severe challenge that we have in our hands. We didn't discover global warming all of a sudden and say, oops, okay, let's dial it back. We've known about it for a while, and we have a very strong track record of not doing enough on it. So I challenge anyone who believes that we're going to magically transform human nature and somehow make great strides of progress by electrification and planting trees and magic sustainability to solve this extremely pervasive and challenging problem. We do not have a track record that supports this, and the problem is much more serious than people who simply want to fight believe. That's not how you solve global warming. I'm going to show you a series of photos here. They may seem contrasting, but I would like hands from the audience as to what they may have in common. So, a single word answer will do. Any ideas? Well, the answer is California. And this is why we're a melting pot. We're a state of contrasts, and we're a state of diversity. We have the highest point, Mount Whitney, in the lower 48, and also the lowest point in Death Valley. We have the Walk of Fame in Hollywood, and then we have the Bridgeport Rodeo Week. We have the fields and the hills of Kern County, and we have the financial district of San Francisco. We have the Berkeley protesters, and then just a few miles away in Rio Vista, we have Foster's Bighorn, where you can see a pretty impressive collection of taxidermy. So really, these are contrasting, polar opposites, even if you like, points of view, ways to see the world. But this is California. And I firmly believe that we can come together and make CDR work in a way that has benefit for everybody. It's not going to happen if we all go away in our silos and try and do what we've always done. We know that this doesn't move things fast enough, and we know that this is not going to rise to the global warming challenge. So this is why I think we need the melting pot approach. We need to acknowledge our differences, foster the necessary dialogue, and make this work. I want to finish with a couple of words here on the size and the nature of the opportunity that we have ahead of us. This is an aerial view of the states, and you can distinctly see the shape of the Central Valley. This is a valley that's in places 12,000 feet deep. These are sediments that over geologic time, the rivers from the Sierra Nevada and the shifting waters have deposited. The map on the right is essentially a snapshot of the gift from God that the state received. It's from a USGS study that maps out depth to basement, and you will see that west of the Rockies in the Pacific Northwest, there aren't many places where you have the pink color, those deep sediments that can safely accommodate the carbon that we've pulled out of the ground. This is a gift that the Central Valley of California has, and we can send CO2 back down there, and while doing that, we can do many other good things. There's plenty of storage. We took a closer look at this a few years ago, and California emits about roughly 425, 450 million tons of CO2 equivalent a year, depending on what you count and what you miss out. Just by looking at Kern County and the Delta, just two areas, we think there could be 17 billion tons of CO2 storage and perhaps even more. So we're not going to run out of space. There are several co-benefits to doing this. First one is cleaner air. If we can take the waste biomass that the state has from farming, from forest management to reduce the risk of wildfires, and from our municipal trash, we can put tens of thousands of tons of CO2 per year underground. This is carbon capture that nature has already done for us. We don't need to build machines to do that. We can do that too, and we will need to as well. But we have a leg up. We can reduce wildfire risk. Right now, CAL FIRE and the Forest Service are removing fuels from the forest to reduce those massive and destructive wildfires that we've seen in recent years, and they don't know what to do with them. We can't burn them because of the risk of air pollution, and we don't know how to convert them. This is where CDR comes in. We can make those into carbon-free, clean fuels, and put the carbon back underground. This can have a significant beneficial effect on local jobs and local economies. It can bring revenue and benefits to communities, to farmers, to reclamation districts, to counties, create local jobs. And then in a manner that should be no surprise to anyone in California, we can create technology export opportunities and move our expertise and experience to other parts of the world. This is one of the main ways in which California can be and has been impactful. This is Kern County, our place for today and for many of you home. I want to finish by stressing just how unique Kern County is and the magnitude and the quality of the opportunity that this carbon management challenge brings to the county. There are many unique elements to Kern County. Geology. It sits in a region of the Central Valley that's really prime for CO2 storage. Land area, it's a large county. Renewable energy. You have resources that other parts of the state or the nation do not. You can make the carbon footprint of projects a lot lower by using cleaner energy. You have an established workforce in expertise. We're going to have to deal with the subsurface when we're putting CO2 back on the ground. Well, guess what? You've had people who've been pulling out the carbon. They're also going to be probably pretty good at putting the carbon back in, and you can keep them at work. We have biomass. This is where nature has done the work capturing CO2 for us. There's extensive agriculture in the state, in the county, and this means captured biomass waiting to be returned on the ground. And then finally, and very much importantly, we have permitting expertise. The county is a veteran in getting things done from a permitting standpoint and undertaking what's really a complex endeavor in an efficient way. So I think these are all unique strengths that Kern County has, which can bring both global and local benefits. I want to finish on a note of optimism. I'm told, you talk about global warming, you mustn't overwhelm people, leave on a note of optimism. Well, maybe it's just me, but I like to keep it real at the same time. I wish I could stand here and tell you that things are going to be hunky-dory and that we're going to magically solve this. I think things have already gotten somewhat ugly, and they're going to get uglier. Every 1/10 of a degree counts. Every single year, week, day that we spend at our jobs makes a difference. This is a big challenge. How are we going to solve it? I don't know. My experience with human nature is that we're going to do something, probably not as much as we should and probably not as quickly as we should, but that's no reason to not live every single day fighting for it. So just as cyclamens emerge from bare rock, I want to leave you on a note of optimism and hope, and urge that we all get to work, talk to each other, and try to make this work for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. That was great.